I'm going to be journeying in the coming episodes and starting today with you through the history of the soul, the history of the psyche, or the psyche as the Greeks used to call it. And I'm going to invite you to join me. The answers and indeed the questions that we pose to this subject, I think, have real world implications. It's really important for things like, our understanding of our lives in the context of death, post-mortem survival. Do we go on? If we go on, what exactly goes on? To medical ethics and to questions around psychology and self-improvement and human growth and flourishing, psychotherapy, who and what we are and what we are as souls or living beings is a crucial question. So let's travel back in time. We're going to go pre-Socrates, the Greek philosopher Socrates, and explore some of the ideas as it evolves through Greek thinking. We start in the Homeric period, about 1200 BCE to about 800 BCE. And what we see back there, if we start, are some very shady ideas of the soul. It's really quite nebulous. The soul just means, in that period, someone's life. So if a warrior dies on the field of battle, his or her soul basically departs from their body, and that's pretty much it. That's pretty much the idea that they have. We go to, in the same period, a philosopher Thales. Interestingly, he sees souls as kind of magnetic, and that actually, when you stop and think about it, makes a little bit of sense. I mean, if you think about magnets, what do? Magnets are, or magnetism at least, is an unseen force that causes visible and seen things to move. So souls must be the kind of force that causes matter to move. Makes sense in a way. You can see the logic, you can see the thinking. Whether we laugh at their ideas or not, what I think is important is we peer beneath just the individual ideas and we kind of try and grapple with the process of their thinking. What are they after? What are they trying to make sense of? And we're trying to still make sense of what exactly human consciousness is today. So as we go on this journey, be sympathetic to some of these thinkers, even if some of their ideas might seem ludicrous to us today, because like us, they're reasoning and thinking and puzzling things out. And, who knows, some of our ideas, in fact, I'm pretty sure some of the 20th century, 21st century ideas in 100 years' time are going to look pretty wacky. By the time we reach the 5th century BCE, we've got a lot of Greek doctors thinking through these questions, and they start to add to the idea of soul a whole bunch of new attributes. So the soul isn't just animating stuff anymore. It is attributed with emotions, with senses, with pleasure, with pain, and also like moral qualities and character and thought, interestingly. And they see animals as ensouled as well. With Pythagoras around the year 570, we see increasing amount of expansion of what's attributed to the soul in terms of its capacities. But what I want to underscore here is that the soul back then is not seen as some kind of immaterial thing. It's actually seen as a kind of subtle type of matter. So yeah, back to that question that I posed in a sense a minute ago. Why actually have this idea of the soul to start with? Well, I think there are kind of 3 main reasons why we see the idea of the soul develop. First reason is that we humans need to explain why animals and humans, and indeed plants for the ancient Greeks, why they seem alive and why they seem to be able to do things like move, choose, or at least select, and certainly for humans, think. Unlike rocks, mountains, and rivers, animals seem to be in motion in a different kind of way. We're kind of self-moving. Second reason I think we posit the idea of the soul, back in history is that humans and animals and plants, for the Greeks, seem to be made of bits of stuff that are self-organizing. They seem to be like a unified whole, like a whole being, like a whole plant, a whole animal, a whole human, but that's made of many parts. And so that then invites the question, what is it that's not actually that just the composite parts that could be responsible for moving them, for organizing them, etc.? Well, some other force that's not the material parts. And I think a third reason why the soul begins to be posited more and thought about more is that there seems to be a distinction between understanding and knowing beings like us and beings that just have senses. So what we see emerging is this delineation, this evolution of the idea of greater soul. In us, sensory data like sight, sound, smell, taste, etc., isn't just experienced as a kind of robotic stimulus and response thing. Like it might be like if we, I don't know, like we created a little computer chip fly. You can get these things, that where you have like a stimulus, press a button or what have you, and then it moves in a certain way or it follows a pattern. We're not just like that. We're not just stimulus response machines, but we also kind of organize the world and make sense of the world epistemically. That means that we make sense of it in terms of knowledge. We interpret the world. We understand the world and what the senses present to us. So we organize our sense impressions with thought. So something, for the Greeks, beyond matter must account for knowledge and for apprehension beyond mere perception. So we have concept and not just percept. So what then emerges through the pre-Socratic period and the pre-Socratic thinkers is this idea of reason, sometimes called the logos, of intelligence, of rational consciousness, as a force in the cosmos, organizing the elements of the cosmos and informing beings like us within the cosmos. Other than a group called the Atomists, which we'll come back to, this approach is by and large what we see. Reason as this kind of animating fire, or sometimes air, and we'll come back to that in a minute, which is taken in by us and allows us to do this apprehension stuff beyond just being animated beings. And notice again, it's an external stuff of sorts, a subtle, energic, although unchanging power. Interestingly, doctors in the 5th century BCE develop out of this what the medieval period then carries on and will recognize as the 4 humours. So soul and reason is seen as kind of in the air, and it enters the body, hits the brain, which is the seat of the intellect and intelligence. But if our pores are blocked or the elements in us get out of balance, then we get physically ill, and of course maybe even mentally ill. Insanity is the result of a lack of the proper air of reason, if you like, reaching the brain and filtering through the body, through the blood. And in the Middle Ages, we have those 4 elements beginning to be used to shape this idea of 4 main personality types, which can be blended to some degree. We get the beginning of personality theory, the personality psychology. And some of that, in a sense, still underwrites modern psychology today. Really interesting. So let me run through that a little bit. So we've got air. That's going to be really important. Air is seen as dry. It's associated with, in the medieval period, with yellow bile, generating what we call choleric temperament. This is associated with being ambitious or leader-like. Now that's really interesting, that element, because again, remember we said air for the Greeks lands in the seat of intelligence. And when we get onto Plato and so on, we'll see that basically rationality, reason, is seen as the quality that particularly should belong to the leader in the state. And we'll see later on, Plato makes a parallel psychologically between the state and the well-ordered state and the well-ordered human being. And so rationality, leadership-like qualities should be at the head in leading. So you can see these connections, okay? And it's also interesting, of course, that we make this connection between the breath, between air. We talk about inspiration allows us to get insight. So that connection between air, breath, and intelligence, and we're going to use the word perception, apprehension, really understanding the world, getting insight. Fire, as another element, obviously associated with being hot, is connected to the blood. We get then in the medieval period this idea of the sanguine temperament. Interestingly, that's associated a lot with adolescence, being hot-blooded, the passions of youth. The third element, water, obviously associated with being moist, seen as a bit of a problem, getting too moist for the ancient Greeks, getting out of balance, being too moist. In the medieval period, associated with black bile, and this is seen as, by the medieval period, as generating the temperament of being melancholic, being analytical, maybe too analytical. We see that actually in depression. People often become more analytical, and their analysis might not be turned effectively to like problem solving and actually changing things, but it might become kind of rumination and overthinking. But the melancholic temperament is, like that, kind of analytical, literal, and is associated for the medieval period with older age. So you see this ancient Greek thinking goes way forward into the medieval period, and it still affects us today in the way we think of personality types and personality psychology. Fourth element is earth, which is associated with cold, with phlegm, and we get the idea of the phlegmatic temperament, which is seen as kind of more relaxed, more kind of thoughtful in a relaxed way, reflective. Probably that's where I would have been categorized or diagnosed, or whatever we want to call it, if I'd have been in the ancient Greek world. So really interesting what they're doing here in terms of the way they're thinking of their personality, they're thinking of character and health and so on. Mental health and physical health is being connected to the elements and to reason as this ultimate kind of force in the cosmos, rational consciousness. Slightly at odds with some of the other Greek thinking are the atomists, who are worth giving a pit stop in. I'm going to actually use them as a bit of a springboard for thinking about our own culture today. So the atomists, philosophers like Democritus, can be thought of as having what we might call the mechanical philosophy, because they kind of see, like materialists often and reductionists often do today, that question I posed right at the beginning, are you just a machine? Can we just explain you by your parts? And the atomists did that. They saw souls as kind of real, existing, but like they did with everything else in the world, they saw everything as made up of bits. That's why they're called atomists. They saw souls as made up of soul atoms, which were kind of slightly subtler particles than ordinary kind of gross material atoms. They saw experiences as explained by the transmission of particles touching and passing on their effects to other particles. So, for example, if I was in ancient Greece and I had my wonderful philosophy mug, just hold that to the camera so you can see it, let you read that. No, I'm actually listening to you if you talk to me, but anyway, I'm just going to put that in there. So if I was an ancient Greek and I had my philosophy mug here, the way they would think of that, the atomists they'd think that there was somehow the particles here would transfer themselves to an air image to an image, an air image, like this, so it's physical, which would then strike my physical eye. So there we go. There's the atomists. Now, Plato, as we'll come back to later, has a serious beef with the way that the atomists think of the soul for all sorts of logical reasons to him. And Plotinus and other people we're going to visit also have beef with the atomists. I have beef with the atomists. I have beef with the modern materialists, but we'll give that some thought in a second. But let's give it some thought now. So the atomists, I think, and modern materialists run into a number of problems. Now, when I give some critiques here, I'm not going to say that all of this, that the atomist thought applies to modern materialists, or that this is some kind of proof that materialism can't explain consciousness and the life of the psychological life of the human being. But there are problems I'm going to raise which I think do match problems that we have today. So the first thing is, if you explain whole things by saying they are the way they are because of their parts, and they're just the way they are, if you like, because of their parts, have you actually explained anything? We tend to think that, if I understand the parts my mug is made up, it's made of handle, it's made of this body part, but then this is all made of ceramic or whatever it is, and then the ceramic's made of like these molecules, and these molecules are made of these atoms, and these atoms then made of these protons and neutrons, and these neutrons are made of quarks and the rest of it. Have I actually explained what this is? Or have I just pushed the question further back? So when we explain a whole by its parts, we don't ever reach a full explanation, which is what I think sometimes reductionists hope for. All you've done is you've pushed the question further back. Because if I say, this is the problem the atomists had, this is the criticism that was made of the atomist. If I say this thing is made up of all these particles, then the next question is, okay, well, I understand the whole is all these parts put together. The whole is nothing but the composite of all these bits, these parts. But then the trouble is I can take each part and treat that now as a new whole. It's whole in itself, I say an atom, right? Well, don't I have to do the same thing to the atom, right? Well, what's it made of? Okay, and you go back on this, you can go back on this infinitely. Okay, so reduction doesn't really get you ever to full explanation. You always arrive at either positing some bottom whole thing, or you have to keep going backwards forever. But you're still stuck with a whole at some point that you can't explain. The second point I want to make here is, we saw earlier that the idea of the soul arose in part, no pun intended, to unify reality and conscious experience. And conscious experience is always unified. And the problem is, if we try to explain soul and consciousness, if you like, maybe through the idea of soul atoms, then that doesn't quite match our experience. We don't experience consciousness as a myriad of parts. We experience consciousness as a unified whole. Now, true enough, we have, like you can see in my screen, like my clock here and my little pottery thing I've made a while back here, my Buddha figure, and each of my books. There's parts that I can name, if you like, within the field of my consciousness, but it's actually all a unified field. So my voice right now, the light of my lamp, my clock, etc. All of these things are in one field of conscious experience. And where I am, I'm getting temperature and smell, etc., in addition to the things that you're seeing. But it's all one unified experience. And we've run into a problem if we take an atomistic approach to consciousness, that that the Greeks were trying to solve through the idea of the soul. We need something that unifies experience. The third thing, and then whether you agree with that, whether you agree, for example, that whether we might arrive at some solution to how we explain consciousness through matter, which I don't think we will. I've got that on other videos you can look at. Whether or not you agree with that, it doesn't matter. The point I'm trying to make is that you can see the logic and why the Greeks were positing the soul and what they were trying to do. Their process of thinking is really what we're interested in here. The third thing I just want to point out is that we need the idea, or the Greeks felt we need the idea of a soul as a way to explain why humans, animals, and of course plants, I'm pointing out back here, by the way, because I used to have a plant here. It's not here anymore, but anyway, for the Greeks, plants as well, we need souls, or they felt we need souls to explain the function of these things, ourselves, animals, plants, as wholes, as whole organisms, okay? Because the behavior of all of these organisms has top-down causation as well as bottom-up. They seem to function as a autonomous, or some degree autonomous, self-organizing, self-directing entity. So we need to explain the relationship between the parts and the wholes. We need something to unify why this is a unified functioning thing. Now, I'm not offering that as proof of souls, etc. But you can see again why the Greeks were after something that would be a unifying, organizing force. So just to wrap up, the Greeks, the pre-Socratic Greeks, were wrestling with really interesting questions around experiences of being, moving, thinking, living consciousnesses. And the questions that they asked are in many ways still the questions that we ask today. How do you explain consciousness and experience and human psychology if we're just lumps of dead matter that somehow are alive and thinking? So their questions were very much our questions today, even if we might not answer them in exactly the same way. So stay with me. I'd love you to come join me on my next episode, where we'll be thinking about Plato's idea of the soul and Plato's psychology. And then we'll probably move on to then the Stoics and then Aristotle after that. If you've not yet subscribed to the channel, please do, because it helps us to spread this stuff even further, and do share it with any friends that you know are interested in all of this stuff. Maybe people are interested in psychology or self-growth or spirituality, whatever. Do share it on, and please give a like, because it helps us with the old YouTube algorithm. And also, really importantly, do put a comment in there, because I do generally try to interact with people who leave comments. So have a bit of a conversation going on, and you can have a conversation between you. And even if I don't comment, I will at least usually put a like, just to acknowledge that I've seen your comment. So thank you for watching. See you next time.